In this video, we will be analyzing a chess game played by Capablanca, and Capablanca used an incredibly interesting opening with black in this game, and this is an opening that I had personally never seen before. I think it's a very old opening, almost nobody plays it anymore, but it's actually quite interesting. So Capablanca playing with the black pieces, and we are playing against d4. This is an opening that you can use whenever you are playing against the Queen's Gambit opening. So d4, Capablanca puts a pawn in the center, d5, and white plays the Queen's Gambit opening, which is this, it's d4 with c4. And Capablanca always favors very, very simple openings. Openings that barely have theory, basically. Openings where you just try to follow opening principles, and that's why I think the opening he played here is so great. So to remember this line, it's actually quite easy. White attacks our pawn, so we protect our pawn. White develops a knight and attacks our pawn. We develop a knight and we protect our pawn. White pins our knight to the queen, so we unpin by putting the bishop on e7. And white plays e3 because, of course, white would like to develop the bishop to d3, the knight to f3, castle. And this position that we have here is a very common position. Literally millions of times this has already been played. I have had this, I think 500 times probably already with black, and I'm sure you have played this as well. And it's in this position that Capablanca plays a move. He played this quite often, which nobody really plays anymore. So the common moves here that you will see all of the time is castle, h6, or knight d7. And those are also the moves that I have played. But here Capablanca plays something else, which is incredibly interesting. He plays knight to e4, putting the knight in the center. And this move is interesting, but it's a little bit difficult to understand at first. So why are we doing this? Well, we are attacking this bishop 3 times. The knight, the queen, and the x-ray attack from the bishop and the queen as well. So white needs to do something with this. The knight also attacks this knight. All right. And there are multiple things that could happen here. I think the most common one we are going to get most of the time is that white will exchange this bishop. But we are going to, which is how it happened in the game, but we are going to first have a look at this move, knight takes e4. So if white takes the knight, we will just capture back. And this looks strange, because we have doubled pawns. We have 2 pawns on the same file, but doubled pawns are not always a weakness. Doubled pawns are a weakness if they are isolated. Isolated means that the adjacent files have no pawns. Well, there is a pawn here, so we could technically play f5 and connect all of the pawns. So it's not a weakness, and it's also a useful pawn. Why is this pawn useful? Well, it's taking away the f3 square from the knight, and it's also taking away the d3 square from the bishop. So this is actually quite an annoying point. It's really stopping white in their development. White still has to solve the bishop problem, which most likely they will trade. And then we get this position. And from here, the game can just continue. White will struggle a little bit to develop the pieces, because if they play bishop e2, well, where is this knight going to go? The knight doesn't really have any good squares, and you don't want to play knight here. Black also always has the move e5, opening up the diagonal for the bishop, so the knight can actually not go to h3. So e5 is a very important move here to remember as well. And if they go with the knight, sure, but now the bishop is locked in, and it will take them quite some moves to get their pieces into play, and we can always play f5 and just hold on to that pawn in the center, and strategically this pawn is actually quite good for us. So this is a very, very interesting opening that nobody plays, but I think it's really worth trying this out. There is one more line I wanted to show, which I think a lot of beginners could fall for, which is that they play the queen here to c2 to try to win back that pawn. There are multiple things you can do here. You can give this check and probably we will get a queen trade. But the most interesting option, looks very strange, is to play e5. And e5 is amazing because if they take with the queen, we give this check. They have to move the king. We castle. And this looks strange because they are just grabbing some free pawns here, but their king is actually quite exposed. We are castled, we can win back this pawn, and we have some counterplay there. And if they take this, With the pawn, they would actually be losing instantly because of rook check, and then it's just going to be game over from there. So e5 is an important move to remember against this queen c2. So all of this to say that this is a very interesting opening that I think it's really worth having a look at because it's so simple to play and nobody plays this anymore. White instead played a more logical approach. They just exchanged the bishops. Instead of going for that knight trade, they exchanged the bishops. And here they played a very good move. Pawn takes d5. And pawn takes d5 is a good move because we cannot just take back. If we take back, we are losing that pawn because the knight is attacking this. Plus, our knight is also unprotected. So basically, this forces black to go for the exchange, which is what Capablanca played. Exchange the knights, and then we take in the center. And I think that this is probably the best position that white can try to get from this. Everything else that we had a look at, which I am sure so many people will try, they will try to give you that double pawn, but all of those positions are way worse for white. I think this is the best option if white wants to still have a solid game. And the position is good for black even as well, because we have this queen that's developed, we can castle on the next move, we have a central pawn, everything is okay. The game continued here with white playing queen to b3, attacking the pawn, and Capablanca playing pawn to c6 to protect the pawn. And the good thing with this position and with this opening is that there are just so many different plans that you can use as black in this position to get quite some good counterplay. Capablanca starts with castling, which makes a lot of sense. We want to have our king safety first, and white develops the knight. And here there are a bunch of different moves we can play. Interesting moves could be bishop to e6, because we are helping to control the center. The bishop is also on the same diagonal as the queen. Pawn to b6 could also be interesting. Maybe something with bishop a6 there as well. Capablanca instead played knight to d7, which is also good. Develops the knight, controls some central squares. Okay. White could castle here. White doesn't castle. White instead plays pawn to a4. And the good thing with this position is that literally everything is possible. There is no one single best plan. There are so many things we can do. If I was playing this, I would probably play knight to f6, get this knight from the passive square to the very good square f6, where we are controlling the center, and that also opens up our bishop again for the future. Probably what I would play. Capablanca instead played rook to d8. Also makes sense. We are putting the rook here, protecting this pawn, because we might want to do a c5 counterattack. And the c5 counterattack is the most important plan to remember for the middle game if you want to try out this opening. The c5 counterattack is our most important move, because this is how we can try to open up the position, maybe get tactics, maybe get a fork in there with the knight. So that's our most interesting move. All right. White castles, and Capablanca really wants to play c5, but if we play c5 right here, we are just losing that central pawn. So yes, it's good that we have the rook here, but the knight is still in our way. So Capablanca played very typical grandmaster move. I call this knight to f8, putting the knight back on the first rank. Okay. I would probably have gone knight to f6, looks more logical, but knight to f8 is actually a good move, and the knight now also has access to the e6 square, and on the e6 square it also helps to support our plan, which is to play the c5 pawn push. So this is what you can remember when you want to play this opening, that the c5 pawn push is really what you want to achieve. Okay, they play rook to b1, trying to put pressure here on this file, and black can actually already play c5 right here if we wanted to. We could just play c5, which is great. It comes with a threat of forking the bishop and the queen, and if they take, that's also great. We can develop the queen, and then they have some pawn weaknesses that we can try to target. But Capablanca is very patient, which is okay with this opening. You can just take it slow. So he played rook to b8, protect the pawn that's severely under attack here by the queen and the rook. Okay, white plays pawn to a5, and again, we are looking to play c5. Could we do it right here? For sure. Can we also wait a little bit? Yeah, that's also possible. So now we can develop the bishop, because the queen and the rook, they are both protecting this pawn, which is necessary here. Because in this opening, the b file is always open for white, so you need to keep an eye on this pawn, which is what we are doing here. The bishop here is also great, because once we get that c5 pawn moving, this pawn might also be able to move, and then we have that discovery attack on the queen. So a lot of very simple plans that you can remember here. Okay, and then here, white plays rook to a4. And as I said, in this position, you can literally just keep optimizing. You can keep preparing the c5 push. Interesting with bishop e6 is also that it protects this pawn. So the knight can actually go back to d7. It actually went away so the bishop could move. Now it can go back, and that means that we can then play c5. And c5 is just becoming more and more important as the game progresses, because of course if they take, we would have a very nice fork. If they don't take, we are actually also threatening to do a fork with c4. So it's a very good move. Okay, but instead of preparing even more, Capablanca said, okay, it's time, I will play c5 right here. Okay, and how does white have to deal with this? It's actually not that easy. If they take, they are actually in trouble. Not because of queen takes c5, which is an okay move, but because of pawn to d4, which we talked about before. This comes with the discovery here on the queen. Queen has to move, we can take, and look at this pawn structure for white. Just look at this pawn structure. This is a completely terrible pawn structure. Like 4 isolated pawns. We will just be able to pick these up one by one in the endgame. And that's really one of the main plans with this opening, is to give white a very bad pawn structure. So yeah, white cannot capture. They also have to be careful, because if they play a random move, they are running into pawn to c4, which forks both of their pieces. So they have to either move the queen or the bishop. That's pretty much the only thing they can do. And white plays the move queen to a3, which I think if you play this opening, this is probably the move that you are going to get most often. Queen to a3, which it looks like it's a genius move for white. It really looks like a genius move, because we cannot take, we would be losing our queen. And we cannot push, because we would be losing our queen. And this pawn is under attack twice, and we might be in trouble. But there is actually a very nice sequence here that you can play as black, and I'm just amazed that Capablanca found this. Black just wins the game here, but you have to play this perfectly. How can we find the best move? Well, all we have to do is basically just follow the CCT strategy. We need to look for checks. We don't have any checks. We need to look for captures. Well, our capture doesn't work. And we need to look for threats. And the threat is really where we have a winning move here. The threat is bishop to d7. And as you can see, this rook is trapped. The rook cannot go up, the rook cannot go down, and the rook can also not go sideways, because the pawns are covering these squares. So the rook is under attack. But white has a simple way of solving this. They play the bishop to b5. And of course, if we take, then they just take back, and that would actually not be so good for us, because we are activating all of their pieces, and the c5 pawn is still pinned to the queen. But there is one move that still wins the game for white. Checks, captures, threats. It's another threat. It's bishop to f5. Okay, we attack the rook, and the rook just moves. And this feels like we are not making any progress as black. Like we attack the rooks, but they are always protected. But we are actually making progress, because now we can play the move pawn to a6. Pawn to a6 forces the bishop to move, and we literally just go back. We do the exact same threat yet again. Bishop to d7, we attack the rook, and this time the rook is trapped. Also, did you notice that these were 4 great moves in a row, which means that these 4 moves in a row were the only 4 moves that would keep black in the game, and that would keep the advantage for black. I'm just amazed that Capablanca managed to find this or invent this before the game. I'm not sure, but it's a very nice strategy to remember. And the rook is basically just trapped at this point. And I don't think anyone who plays queen a3 here would see this coming, that suddenly they would get this position after a lot of maneuvering where their rook is trapped. Okay, so from this point forward, the game is quite easy. I mean, Capablanca can literally just win the exchange. We can win the rook in exchange for the bishop, which is great. And here we are going to learn how to convert an endgame like this, because I know a lot of people would still blunder this endgame, most likely. The point with c5 was, well, to either create pawn weaknesses, but also pushing to c4 is very important. It really shuts down their position, and it also helps us to eventually start pushing pawns here on the queen side. So pawn to c4. Okay. White plays h3, and Capablanca just gets the knight back into the game. Whenever you are up material, the most important thing to do is to try to play for trades. So we are offering a knight trade. The opponent accepts it. So we offer a queen trade. And of course, White didn't take this, but with every trade that happens, it just gets easier and easier to convert these positions into a win. White didn't want to make it easy, so instead they moved the queen. And we just have a very simple plan here in this opening, which is to always play on the queen side. So we want to start pushing pawns on the queen side, especially in the late middle game and in the end game. The entire opening here is literally about the queen side. So Capablanca plays a queen to c7. And the reason that we play this is we are trying to push b5. Bishop here doesn't do much, rook to d6. And you can see all of our pieces are preparing so that we can push b5, so that if they take en passant, all of our pieces will be active. White is trying to generate some counterplay here, but it's not really possible. Pawn to e4, we can just take, and then we can continue with our plan b5. And all that we want to do is, if White plays whatever random move, is we want to keep pushing the pawns. We want to see if we can create a passed pawn. And even this is good for us, giving away the pawn, because we want to create a passed pawn. We want to keep pushing and see if we can eventually promote that pawn, and that will always be possible, unless if White sacrifices some material. So White just says, okay, I will take en passant, but yeah, all of our pieces were prepared to do this. Now we have two rooks here on this file. And important, if they move the rook away, they have to also watch out for back rank checkmate threats, because the queen is covering the square. There is no back rank checkmate straight away, because the bishop is still here, but it might be a problem in the future. So White just decides, okay, let us exchange a pair of rooks, and then play bishop here to try to win a pawn. Okay, interesting. Capablanca just plays rook to b3. White cannot take this, otherwise the queen would take. So this is a beautiful way, I think, to protect this pawn. Because this pawn is attacked twice, it's only defended once, and we cannot add any extra defenders. Like if we add extra defenders, we always lose the defender. But by playing this and disconnecting the pieces, line blocking is what this is called, we block the line between the pieces, the pawn is actually safe. And they cannot take this free pawn, because remember, the back rank is still weak. The back rank checkmate is still here. So rook to b3 is just an amazing move. Instead of falling for the back rank mate, White plays g3 to give the king a square, and now they are really threatening to win this pawn. So we need to keep an eye open for this. But Capablanca just says, nope, I play g6. I also want to solve my back rank problems. You can have the pawn. I will take your pawn. And we achieved the thing that we wanted all along, which is a passed pawn. A pawn that we can push to promotion. Okay. And from here, it's pretty easy. Capablanca makes sure his king is safe. We want to see if we can still trade. And we also are looking to see if we can either push the passed pawn or start some type of counter-attack against their king by activating our pieces. And in a position like this, where we have the rook and the queen, we should be able to attack. Because if we attack a dark squared pawn, the light squared bishop won't be able to defend it. So that's what we are looking for here. Some maneuvering going on. I won't go super in-depth for everything. But basically, eventually Capablanca picks up the pawn, loses this pawn, but everything is okay, because we still have a rook versus bishop situation, which is always going to be winning. Queen to b7 check, king goes up, and then we have queen to c6, which is very nice, because we are trying to get a trade. We are trying to get this trade, a trade of queens. And I know that probably a lot of you watching this would think, oh no, wait, isn't this becoming a draw? No. If you have a rook versus knight or a rook versus bishop situation, you win the endgame. you win the endgame. And we are going to see exactly how to win this endgame. So we need to start pushing pawns. We need to activate our king, and we need to try to make progress. Because we will only be able to win this game if we can try to either win the bishop or win a pawn and see if we can push to promotion. White is trying to give us counterplay, but none of it really works. All right. And at this moment, White even has to watch out because they don't want to suddenly get checked and also lose their bishop. So what they do is they move their king here, but that was actually a fatal mistake. White is losing anyways, but Capablanca can put the rook here. And this king is actually trapped right now. The king is just completely out of squares. They give a check, and this is an incredibly interesting position. There is actually only one move here, only one move that wins the game for black. Because if we move the king, White can suddenly go here and they can start picking up all of our pawns. We would be blocking in our own rook. And if we go here, we go sideways, suddenly there is h5 and the pawn structure is falling apart and White is also coming in and grabbing a pawn. So the only move that wins the game is king e4. King e4 protects this pawn, and yeah, if they try to go in, we always have the move rook to d7, protect the pawn. So you always have to be careful. Even in this endgame, it's possible to blunder this. White still tries to play this. They try to play h5, which we can take. They are doing this to see if they can break up the pawn structure, but it doesn't really matter. And here Capablanca plays a very interesting move, which is pawn to h6, basically saying, look, if you take this, you are losing because I will be picking up this pawn, and then I will just be promoting. White realizes this, so they go back with the king. And I think the next move, which was the final move in the game, is really one of the most elegant endgame finishers I have ever seen. Capablanca plays the incredible move, pawn to h4, and the opponent just resigns. Why? Well, if the king takes the pawn, that's checkmate. That's a checkmate. The pawn is cutting off the escaping square, and the king is just checkmated. If the pawn takes the pawn, well, check, and they lose the bishop. So the king cannot move, the pawn cannot take. The only thing they could do is like maybe move their bishop, but then everything is going to fall apart, and eventually we will be able to check away the king, win this, and then it's just a 2-pawn-up endgame with that rook. So incredibly elegant. So I think this is a very good opening. Please try it out and drop a comment to let me know how it went.